The red warning lights flashed across the bridge of the Federation cruiser Zenith's Edge, as Admiral Kethvar stared at the incoming transmission with growing concern. The message had traveled for 3 days across the void of space from the outer, rim colony of New Kepler, and what it contained made his 4 hearts beat faster with worry. Commander Jake Morrison stood beside the Admiral's command chair, his human features tense as he watched the holographic display show the last known position of the Vorgak raiding fleet that was heading straight toward his people's colony. "Admiral, my people need help," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that came with being the only human officer aboard a Federation warship. The Admiral's purple skin darkened slightly as he considered the tactical situation, displayed on the main screen. 12 Vorgak heavy cruisers and 48 fighter craft were moving through hyperspace toward New Kepler, a journey that would take them exactly 6 days from their last known position. The Vorgak were known throughout the galaxy as brutal, raiders who took what they wanted and destroyed what they could not carry away. Their ships were heavily armored with energy shields that could deflect most conventional weapons, and their crews fought with the savage determination of warriors who knew only victory or death. Admiral Kethvar had fought the Vorgak twice in his long career, and both times the Federation forces had barely managed to drive them off despite having superior numbers and technology. "Commander Morrison, I understand your concern for your people, but we must be realistic about what humans can accomplish against a full Vorgak raiding fleet," the Admiral said, his translator converting his thoughts into words that Jake could understand. The human officer's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent as the Admiral continued his explanation. The Federation databases showed that humans had only been in space for a few hundred years, which made them little more than children, compared to species like the Alterians who had been traveling between stars for over 10,000 years. Human ships were built with primitive materials and powered by chemical rockets that seemed laughably slow compared to the antimatter drives used by more advanced civilizations. Their weapons were even more concerning to Federation strategists, as humans still relied on kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives instead of the energy weapons that had become standard throughout the galaxy. Captain Lisa Brooks appeared, on the communication screen from the bridge of her ship, the human defense vessel Defiant, which was currently orbiting New Kepler along with 5 other human warships. Her short brown hair was pulled back in a military style, and her green eyes showed the kind of determination that Admiral Kethvar had learned to associate with human stubbornness. "Admiral, we appreciate any help the Federation can provide, but we want you to know that we're not planning to run from this fight." The Admiral studied the technical specifications of the human ships that appeared on his tactical display, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears about the coming battle. The Defiant and her sister ships were barely 200 meters long, making them smaller than most Federation escort vessels, and their hulls appeared to be made from steel alloys that would offer little protection against Vorgak plasma cannons. The humans had no energy shields, no particle beam weapons, and no antimatter warheads that could crack open the armored hull of a Vorgak cruiser. "Captain Brooks, I must be honest with you about the tactical situation," Admiral Kethvar said carefully, trying to find words that would not sound insulting while still conveying the reality of what the humans were facing. "The Vorgak fleet heading toward your colony represents more firepower than your entire species has ever assembled in one place. Their ships are designed specifically for breaking through planetary defenses and overwhelming smaller forces through superior technology and numbers." Lisa Brooks smiled in a way that made the Admiral slightly uncomfortable, as if she knew something that he did not understand. "Admiral, we've been tracking the Vorgak fleet for the past 4 days, and we have a pretty good idea of what they're capable of. We also have a few ideas of our own about how to handle uninvited guests who come calling with bad intentions." The communication from New Kepler continued for another 10 minutes as Captain Brooks provided updates on civilian evacuation procedures and defensive preparations. But Admiral Kethvar found himself focusing more on what the humans were not saying than on their actual words. There was something in the way the human officers carried themselves that suggested they were not as worried about the approaching Vorgak fleet as they should have been. Commander Morrison remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, but the Admiral noticed that he showed no signs of the panic or desperation that would be expected from someone whose homeworld was about to be attacked by overwhelming enemy forces. Instead, the human liaison officer seemed almost calm, as if he was waiting for something to happen rather than dreading the arrival of the Vorgak raiders. When the communication ended, Admiral Kethvar turned to face Jake directly and asked the question that had been troubling him since the conversation began. "Commander, your people seem remarkably confident for a species that is about to face their first major battle against one of the most feared raiding forces in the galaxy. Is there something about human military capabilities that our databases have failed to record?" Jake Morrison looked out at the stars visible through the bridge viewport and was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Admiral, my people have been fighting wars for thousands of years, and we've learned a few things about survival along the way. The Vorgak may have better ships and bigger guns, but they're making one very important mistake in their calculations." "What mistake would that be, Commander?" "They think this is going to be a fair fight," Jake said with the same unsettling smile that Captain Brooks had shown earlier. The Admiral felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature control systems on his ship. The final transmission from New Kepler came 18 hours later, just as the Federation relief fleet was preparing to jump to hyperspace. Captain Lisa Brooks appeared on screen one last time, her image flickering slightly due to interference from the approaching Vorgak fleet. "Admiral, this is our final communication before things get interesting around here. The Vorgak fleet will be dropping out of hyperspace in approximately 6 hours, and we'll be ready to welcome them properly." The transmission ended with a simple message that would haunt Admiral Kethvar's dreams for years to come. "Vorgak fleet approaching. We'll handle this." The Federation relief fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the New Kepler system 3 days later, expecting to find the familiar aftermath of a Vorgak raid. Admiral Kethvar had seen such scenes before: burning orbital stations, debris, fields where defense ships had made their final stands, and the ominous silence of a world that had been stripped of everything valuable before being left to die in the cold of space. The Admiral's tactical officer, a young Altarian named Subcommander Veltar, began scanning the system with the ship's most advanced sensors, while the rest of the fleet moved into standard formation behind them. "Admiral, I'm reading multiple debris fields throughout the system, but the patterns are not what we expected," Veltar reported, his voice carrying a note of confusion that made Admiral Kethvar move closer to the sensor station. The holographic display showed the New Kepler system in three-dimensional detail, with red markers indicating the locations of destroyed vessels scattered across millions of cubic kilometers of space. What Admiral Kethvar saw on that display would challenge everything he thought he knew about warfare in the galaxy. The debris fields were not concentrated around New Kepler's orbital defenses or grouped near the planet, where human ships might have made a desperate last stand. Instead, the wreckage was spread throughout the entire system in a pattern that looked almost random, as if someone had taken a handful of metal fragments and thrown them across the star chart without any regard for tactical logic or strategic planning. "Sub-Commander, are you certain these readings are accurate?" the Admiral asked, studying the display more carefully. Each red marker represented the destruction of at least one major warship, and there were far too many markers for what should have been a simple raid against a poorly defended human colony. The computer analysis showed evidence of at least 12 heavy cruisers and dozens of smaller vessels, all destroyed in what appeared to have been a one-sided battle. Commander Jake Morrison stood quietly beside the sensor station, watching his superior officers try to make sense of what their instruments were telling them. The human liaison officer had been unusually silent during the 3-day journey to New Kepler, spending most of his time in his quarters or staring out the observation windows at the stars. Now he seemed to be waiting for something, as if he knew exactly what the Federation fleet would find when they arrived. "Admiral, I'm receiving a transmission from New Kepler," the communications officer announced. The main screen flickered to life, showing the familiar blue and green surface of the human colony world, which appeared to be completely undamaged from orbit. No burning cities, no radiation signatures from orbital bombardment, and no signs of the devastation that should have resulted from a Vorgak attack. Lieutenant Colonel Sam Peterson appeared on the screen, wearing the simple green uniform of the Human Colonial Defense Force. His weathered face and gray hair suggested a man who had seen many battles, but his expression was calm and professional, as he addressed the Federation fleet. "Admiral Cathvar, welcome to New Kepler. We appreciate you coming all this way to check on us, but as you can see, we're doing just fine down here." Admiral Cathvar stared at the human officer in complete bewilderment. "Colonel Peterson, our sensors are detecting the remains of what appears to be an entire Vorgak raiding fleet scattered throughout your system. Can you explain what happened?" "Here." Sam Peterson smiled in the same unsettling way that seemed to be common among human military officers when they discussed combat operations. "Well, Admiral, the Vorgak fleet arrived right on schedule 4 days ago, just like our tracking stations predicted they would. We detected their hyperspace signatures about 30 minutes before they dropped back into normal space, which gave us plenty of time to make final preparations." The Admiral felt his foreheart skip a beat as he processed what the human was saying. "Colonel, are you telling me that your forces engaged and defeated an entire Vorgak raiding fleet without suffering any apparent casualties or damage to your colony?" "That's correct, Admiral. The engagement lasted approximately 47 minutes from start to finish, though most of the Vorgak ships were disabled or destroyed within the first 15 minutes of combat. We spent the remaining time hunting down the few vessels that attempted to flee the system." Sub-Commander Veltar looked up from his sensor station with an expression of complete disbelief. "Admiral, I'm detecting human ships throughout the system, but they're running on minimal power and appear to be conducting salvage operations on the Vorgak wreckage. I count at least 23 human vessels, including several that are significantly larger than anything in our databases." Admiral Cathvar turned to Commander Morrison with a look that demanded an immediate explanation. "Commander, how is this possible? Our intelligence reports indicated that humans had only 6 warships in this entire system, none of them larger than a Federation escort vessel." Jake Morrison finally broke his silence, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice that made the Admiral understand why the Vorgak fleet had been so completely destroyed. "Admiral, those intelligence reports were based on the ships that we allowed your sensors to detect during routine patrols and diplomatic visits. Human military doctrine requires that we maintain operational security regarding our actual defensive capabilities." The communication from Colonel Peterson continued as he provided more details about the battle that had taken place 4 days earlier. The human officer explained that his people had been tracking the Vorgak raiding fleet for over 2 weeks before it arrived at New Kepler, using passive sensors and stealth reconnaissance ships that had followed the enemy force through several star systems without being detected. "We knew exactly when they would arrive, what route they would take through the system, and how they would deploy their ships for the attack," Peterson said matter-of-factly. "By the time the Vorgak fleet dropped out of hyperspace, we had already calculated firing solutions for every enemy vessel and positioned our ships for maximum tactical advantage." Admiral Cathvar studied the tactical display more carefully, trying to understand how such a complete victory had been achieved. The Vorgak were experienced raiders who had been attacking settlements throughout the galaxy for centuries, and their ships were equipped with the best armor and weapons that their civilization could produce. For them to be defeated so completely suggested that the humans possessed military technology far more advanced than anything in the Federation databases. "Colonel Peterson, what type of weapons did your forces use to achieve such decisive results against Vorgak armor and shields?" the Admiral asked. The human officer paused for a moment, as if considering how much information he should reveal to the Federation fleet. "Admiral, we used standard human kinetic weapons, primarily railguns firing depleted uranium projectiles at relativistic velocities. Our missiles carried conventional high-explosive warheads, nothing exotic or particularly advanced by our standards." Sub-Commander Veltar looked confused as he ran calculations on his tactical computer. "Admiral, kinetic weapons should not be effective against Vorgak energy shields. Their defensive systems are specifically designed to deflect solid projectiles and absorb the energy from chemical explosives." Commander Morrison stepped forward to address his fellow officers. "Sub-Commander, Vorgak shields are indeed very effective against conventional kinetic weapons, but they have one significant weakness that most species have never thought to exploit. Energy shields are designed to stop objects that are moving relatively slowly, typically projectiles fired from distances measured in thousands of kilometers." The Admiral felt a cold realization beginning to form in his mind as he listened to the human explanation. "Commander, At what range did your forces engage the Vorgak fleet? The initial engagement began when the enemy ships were still over 2 million kilometers from New Kepler, Jake Morrison replied. Our railgun platforms fired their first salvo while the Vorgak fleet was still decelerating from their hyperspace jump before they had a chance to raise their shields or deploy their fighter escorts. Admiral Kethvar stared at the tactical display with growing understanding and horror. Human weapons might be primitive by galactic standards, but if they could fire projectiles across interplanetary distances with enough accuracy to hit individual targets, then energy shields became irrelevant. The Vorgak fleet had been destroyed before they even knew they were under attack. Colonel Peterson's final words confirmed what the Admiral was beginning to suspect about human military capabilities. Admiral, we want you to know that we appreciate the Federation's willingness to come to our aid, but we've been dealing with hostile visitors for quite some time now. The Vorgak raiders made one critical mistake in their planning. What mistake? Was that, Colonel? They assumed this would be their kind of fight. Admiral Kethvar spent the next 2 days aboard New Kepler, touring the human colony and trying to understand how such a primitive species had managed to defeat one of the most feared raiding forces in the galaxy. The colonial capital was a modest collection of buildings that housed barely 50,000 humans, far smaller than most Federation outposts. Yet these people had just accomplished something that entire star fleets had failed to achieve in centuries of galactic warfare. Commander Jake Morrison led the Admiral through the colony's military command center, an underground facility carved into the bedrock beneath the main settlement. The walls were lined with screens showing tactical displays, sensor readings, and communication channels that monitored space traffic throughout dozens of nearby star systems. What impressed Admiral Kethvar most was not the technology, which seemed fairly basic by Federation standards, but the methodical way that human officers analyzed and cataloged every piece of information that came through their networks. Admiral, I'd like you to meet Colonel Danny Wright, our strategic planning officer, Jake said as they entered a room filled with holographic star charts and tactical projections. The human officer was younger than Admiral Kethvar had expected, probably no more than 40 years old by human standards, but his eyes held the kind of calculating intelligence that reminded the Admiral of the most dangerous predators he had encountered during his long military career. Colonel Wright stood up from his desk and offered the traditional human greeting gesture, which Admiral Kethvar had learned to return during his months of working with Commander Morrison. Admiral, it's an honor to meet you. I understand you have some questions about our recent engagement with the Vorgak raiders. The Admiral studied the tactical displays that surrounded Colonel Wright's workstation, noting the incredible level of detail that the humans had compiled about enemy forces throughout the sector. Ship movement patterns, communication intercepts, supply route analyses, and behavioral predictions filled dozens of screens with data that would have taken Federation intelligence years to gather. Colonel Wright, I must admit that I'm having difficulty understanding how your forces achieved such a complete victory against an enemy that has defeated much larger and better equipped fleets. Danny Wright activated a holographic display that showed the new Kepler system as it had appeared 4 days earlier. With the Vorgak raiding fleet approaching from the outer system boundary, red icons marked the positions of enemy ships while blue markers showed the locations of human defensive units. And Admiral Kethvar was surprised to see that the human forces had been spread throughout the entire system, rather than concentrated around the planet they were supposed to be protecting. Admiral, most species approach space combat the same way they fight battles on planetary surfaces, Colonel Wright began, manipulating the display to show the tactical situation from different angles. They concentrate their forces, establish defensive positions, and wait for the enemy to come to them. This approach works well when both sides are using similar technologies and following the same basic rules of engagement. The holographic replay showed the Vorgak fleet dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their heavy cruisers arranged in a standard attack pattern with fighter escorts screening their flanks. It was a textbook assault formation that had served the Vorgak well in hundreds of previous raids, but Admiral Kethvar could already see that something was wrong with their tactical situation. The Vorgak commanders made their first mistake when they assumed that human defensive forces would be positioned near the planet, Colonel Wright continued, zooming the display to show the empty space around New Kepler, where the raiders had expected to find their targets. They spent almost 30 minutes searching for our ships before they realized that we weren't where they thought we should be. Admiral Kethvar watched the replay with growing fascination as the Vorgak fleet began to spread out through the inner system, searching for human forces that seemed to have simply vanished. The raiders' sensors were some of the best in the galaxy, capable of detecting energy signatures and metal hulls across millions of kilometers. But they found nothing except empty space and the faint background radiation of the system's star. "Colonel, where were your ships during this period?" the Admiral asked, studying the tactical display more carefully. The blue markers representing human forces had disappeared from the hologram, leaving only the red icons of the Vorgak fleet, moving through what appeared to be an undefended system. Danny Wright smiled with the same expression that Admiral Kethvar was beginning to associate with humans who were about to explain something that would challenge his understanding of warfare. "Admiral, our ships were exactly where they needed to be. But Vorgak sensors are designed to detect the energy signatures and heat emissions that most civilizations use to power their vessels. Human ships can operate in what we call cold running mode, shutting down all non-essential systems and drifting through space like pieces of debris." The holographic display suddenly filled with blue markers as Colonel Wright showed the true positions of the human fleet during the Vorgak approach. Admiral Kethvar stared in amazement at what the tactical plot revealed. Human ships had been positioned throughout the asteroid belt, hiding behind planetary moons and drifting in the outer system where no conventional military force would ever think to look for them. "Your forces were already in position before the Vorgak fleet even arrived," the Admiral said, understanding beginning to dawn in his mind. This was not a defensive battle at all. It was an ambush. "That's correct, Admiral. We began positioning our ships 5 days before the Vorgak fleet reached this system, using intelligence gathered by our reconnaissance units that had been tracking their movement patterns for weeks. By the time the raiders dropped out of hyperspace, every human vessel had already calculated firing solutions for multiple enemy targets." The tactical replay continued, showing what happened when the human ships finally revealed themselves. Blue markers appeared throughout the system as human vessels powered up their weapons and began firing kinetic projectiles across impossible distances. Admiral Kethvar watched in fascination as railgun rounds traveled for millions of kilometers before striking Vorgak ships that had no idea they were being targeted. "Admiral, most species think of space combat in terms of energy weapons that travel at light speed and require direct line of sight to their targets," Colonel Wright explained as the hologram showed Vorgak cruisers being torn apart by projectiles that had been fired from positions they couldn't even detect. "Human weapons work differently. We fire solid projectiles that take time to reach their targets, which means we have to predict where enemy ships will be rather than where they are when we pull the trigger." The implications of what Admiral Kethvar was seeing began to sink in as he watched the replay of the battle. Human forces had not simply defeated the Vorgak raiders. They had destroyed them using weapons and tactics that made conventional defensive strategies completely irrelevant. The raiders' energy shields, particle beam weapons, and superior numbers had meant nothing when faced with an enemy that fought according to completely different rules. Captain Maria Gonzalez entered the command center as Colonel Wright was explaining the final phase of the engagement. She was the commander of the human stealth frigate Ghostwalker, one of the ships that had been responsible for tracking the Vorgak fleet during its approach to New Kepler. Her ship was unlike anything in the Federation databases, a sleek vessel designed for invisibility rather than firepower, built to operate in complete silence while gathering intelligence on enemy forces. "Admiral, I understand you have questions about our intelligence-gathering capabilities," Captain Gonzalez said, activating another holographic display that showed the route the Vorgak fleet had taken through 3 different star systems before reaching New Kepler. "We've been monitoring Vorgak raiding patterns for over 2 years, mapping their supply routes and identifying the bases they use to repair and refuel their ships." Admiral Kethvar studied the intelligence data with growing respect for human strategic planning capabilities. The information showed not just the movement of individual ships, but the entire logistical network that supported Vorgak raiding operations throughout the sector. Communication intercepts, Supply manifests, personnel records, and tactical assessments filled the display with details that represented years of patient intelligence work. Captain Gonzalez, this level of intelligence gathering would require resources far beyond what any single colony could maintain, the Admiral said, beginning to understand that the human presence in this sector was much larger than Federation databases had indicated. How many ships and personnel are involved in your operations? Maria Gonzalez exchanged a glance with Colonel Wright before answering, and Admiral Kethvar realized that he was about to learn something that would fundamentally change his understanding of human capabilities. Admiral, the forces you've seen here at New Kepler represent a small part of our overall defensive network. We have reconnaissance units, supply bases, and communication relays positioned throughout this entire region of space. News of what happened at New Kepler spread through the galaxy faster than Admiral Kethvar had expected, carried by merchant ships, diplomatic couriers, and the vast communication networks that connected every civilized world in Federation space. Within 2 weeks of the Vorgak fleet's destruction, every major government and military organization knew that humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic warfare history. The story grew with each retelling, but the basic facts remained the same. A primitive species using outdated technology had completely annihilated one of the most feared raiding forces in known space. The Krillian Empire was the first major power to respond to these reports with something other than disbelief. The Krillians were traditional enemies of the Federation, a warrior culture that respected strength above all else and viewed diplomacy as a sign of weakness. Their military commanders had been planning attacks against Federation border worlds for months, waiting for the right opportunity to test their new warships against alien defenses. The destruction of the Vorgak fleet presented them with an unexpected challenge. If humans could defeat experienced raiders so decisively, what could they accomplish against a real military force? General Thakmor commanded the Krillian Third Attack Fleet, a force of 37 heavy warships that represented some of the most advanced military technology in his empire's arsenal. His ships were equipped with plasma cannons that could melt through asteroid-sized targets, particle shields that had never been penetrated by enemy weapons, and hyperspace drives that could outrun anything else in the galaxy. General Thakmor had spent his entire career fighting battles against inferior opponents, and he had never encountered an enemy that could not be defeated through superior firepower and aggressive tactics. The Krillian fleet arrived at the border colony of Havens, rest expecting to find the same kind of easy victory that had made their empire famous throughout the galaxy. Havens Rest was a human settlement, with barely 20,000 colonists, defended by what Federation intelligence reports described as a handful of obsolete warships and some orbital defense platforms. It should have been a simple matter of overwhelming the human forces and demonstrating that the victory at New Kepler had been nothing more than luck. Fleet Admiral Carlos Rivera commanded the human defense force at Havens Rest, and he approached the incoming Krillian threat with the same methodical planning that had become standard among human military officers. Rivera was a veteran of dozens of engagements against various hostile forces, and he understood that the key to victory was not having better weapons than the enemy, but making sure the enemy never got a chance to use their advantages effectively. First indication that something was wrong came when General Thakmor's communications officer reported unusual activity on the standard diplomatic channels. Someone was intercepting Krillian military transmissions and responding to them with detailed information about Krillian ship movements, crew assignments, and tactical plans. The messages were not threats or demands for surrender, but simple statements of fact delivered in the calm, professional tone that humans seem to use when discussing military operations. General Thakmor, we know that your fleet consists of 37 ships arranged in standard Krillian attack formation. Your flagship Thunder of Victory is currently experiencing minor problems with its port hyperspace motivator, and your chief engineer estimates repairs will be completed within 6 hours. We suggest you take the time to reconsider your current course of action. General Thakmor stared at the message display in complete bewilderment. The information about his ship's mechanical problems was absolutely accurate, but it was contained in classified maintenance reports that should have been impossible for human forces to intercept. The Thunder of Victory's hyperspace motivator had indeed been showing signs of instability, but that information was known only to his senior engineering staff and a few trusted officers. The Krillian fleet continued toward Haven's Rest, but General Thakimor found himself constantly distracted by the stream of messages that continued to arrive on his communication channels. Human forces seemed to know everything about his fleet. Which ships were running low on ammunition, which crews were experiencing morale problems, and which officers were questioning the wisdom of attacking a human colony after what had happened at New Kepler. General, we're detecting unusual sensor readings throughout the system, his tactical officer reported. There appear to be objects moving through the asteroid belt, but our sensors can't get a clear reading on their composition or purpose. They could be natural phenomena, but the movement patterns seem too regular to be random. General Thakmor studied the tactical display with growing unease. The objects his sensors were detecting appeared and disappeared like ghosts, never staying in one location long enough for detailed analysis, but always seeming to maintain positions that would give them tactical advantages over his fleet. It reminded him of stories his grandfather had told about hunting trips in the deep forests of his homeworld, where the prey always seemed to know where the hunters were, even when they couldn't be seen or heard. The psychological pressure continued to build as more messages arrived from the human forces. They contained detailed analyses of Krillian tactical doctrine, accurate predictions of what General Thakmor's fleet would do in various combat scenarios, and suggestions for alternative approaches that might result in fewer casualties on both sides. The messages were not insulting or threatening, but they demonstrated a level of intelligence gathering and tactical awareness that made the general question everything he thought he knew about human capabilities. General Thakmor, your current approach vector will bring your fleet within range of our defensive systems in approximately 4 hours. We have calculated firing solutions for all of your ships and identified the optimal sequence for engaging your forces. Your flagship Thunder of Victory will be our primary target, followed by your heavy cruisers in order of their tactical importance. We estimate the entire engagement will last no more than 27 minutes. The Krillian general found himself in a situation he had never experienced during his long military career. His fleet was approaching an enemy that seemed to know his every move before he made it, and that enemy was providing him with detailed information about how they planned to destroy his forces. The humans were not hiding their capabilities or trying to surprise him with unexpected tactics. Instead, they were simply explaining what was going to happen and giving him the opportunity to avoid it. Admiral Rivera's next message contained a complete tactical analysis of the Krillian fleet's strengths and weaknesses, along with suggestions for how General Thakmor could improve his ship's defensive capabilities if he chose to continue his attack. The information was so detailed and accurate that it could only have come from years of studying Krillian military technology and combat procedures. General, we understand that your empire values courage and military prowess above all else, but we want you to know that attacking Haven's Rest will not demonstrate either of those qualities. Your fleet is moving through a battlefield that we have been preparing for months, and every aspect of this engagement has already been planned and calculated. This is not a fair fight, and there will be no honor in dying here. The Krillian fleet's supply convoy reported that several of their ships had developed mysterious mechanical problems that were forcing them to reduce speed and fall behind the main battle group. Reconnaissance scouts sent to investigate reported finding nothing unusual, but the convoy commander was convinced that someone or something was sabotaging his vessels during their journey through seemingly empty space. General Thakmor's worst fears were confirmed when his scouts began disappearing without sending distress calls or leaving any trace of what had happened to them. The missing ships simply vanished from sensors and communication networks as if they had never existed, leaving no debris fields or energy signatures to indicate how they had been destroyed. The general found himself facing an enemy that could eliminate his forces without revealing their own positions or methods. The final message from Admiral Rivera arrived when the Krillian fleet was still 2 hours away from Haven's Rest. It contained a simple statement that would haunt General Thakmor's dreams for the rest of his life. General, you are currently surrounded by human forces that have been tracking your movement for the past 3 days. Every ship in your fleet is within range of weapons that you cannot detect or defend against. We are offering you one final opportunity to withdraw from this system before we demonstrate why attacking human colonies is considered poor judgment throughout this sector of the galaxy. General Takmor looked at his tactical display and realized that he was no longer commanding a military operation. He was leading his fleet into a trap that had been prepared by an enemy that understood warfare in ways that his empire had never imagined. The humans were not simply defending Haven's Rest. They had turned the entire system into a weapon aimed at anyone who dared to threaten their people. For the first time in his military career, General Takmor gave the order to retreat without engaging the enemy. 6 months after the incident at Haven's Rest, the Federation War College on the planet Nexus Prime hosted its first symposium on human military doctrine. The lecture hall was filled with military officers from 47 different species, all of whom had come to hear what the galaxy's leading strategic analysts had learned about the newest members of the galactic community. General Helen Carter stood at the podium, her simple human uniform contrasting sharply with the elaborate ceremonial dress worn by officers from more traditional military cultures. Admiral Keithvar sat in the front row, still trying to process everything he had witnessed during his months of working with human forces. The Alterian officer had requested reassignment to the Federation Strategic Analysis Division, specifically to study human military capabilities, and what he had learned during that time had changed his understanding of warfare more completely than 4 decades of previous military experience. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to discuss a fundamental shift in galactic military thinking, General Carter began, her voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect amphitheater. For thousands of years, civilized species have approached warfare as a contest between opposing forces, using similar technologies and following generally accepted rules of engagement. The introduction of human military doctrine has rendered those assumptions obsolete. The holographic display behind General Carter showed a 3-dimensional map of local galactic space, with markers indicating the locations of major military engagements from the past 6 months. Red indicators showed where traditional forces had clashed using conventional tactics, while blue markers identified conflicts that had involved human military units. The pattern was unmistakable. Every engagement involving human forces had ended in decisive victory, often with minimal casualties on the human side. Human military philosophy is based on a principle that most of our species have never seriously considered, the general continued, manipulating the display to show detailed tactical analyses of several recent battles. We believe that the best military engagements are those where the enemy is defeated before they realize they are fighting a war. This approach requires a complete reconceptualization of how military forces are organized, deployed, and utilized in combat situations. Commander Veltar, the young Alterian officer who had served with Admiral Kethvar during the New Kepler incident, raised his hand with a question that many in the audience were thinking. General Carter, human forces consistently demonstrate the ability to gather intelligence and position assets in ways that seem impossible using conventional military doctrine. How do your forces achieve such comprehensive battlefield awareness? Helen Carter smiled with the expression that had become familiar to Federation officers who worked closely with human military personnel. Commander, human intelligence gathering is based on the understanding that information is more valuable than firepower. We begin planning for potential conflicts years before they actually occur, positioning reconnaissance assets and establishing communication networks that allow us to monitor hostile activities across vast regions of space. The holographic display changed to show the intelligence network that human forces had established throughout the local sector. Blue lines connected dozens of star systems, indicating communication relays, supply depots, and observation posts that had been operating for months or even years without being detected by other military forces. The scope of the network was staggering, covering hundreds of light years and involving thousands of personnel who worked in complete secrecy. Our reconnaissance ships are designed for long-term independent operations in hostile territory, General Carter explained, showing technical specifications for human stealth vessels that looked nothing like conventional warships. These units can operate for months without returning to base, gathering information about enemy movements, supply routes, and tactical capabilities. By the time we decide to engage hostile forces, we already know everything about their strengths, weaknesses, and probable courses of action. Admiral Zethkai of the Hegemony Navy, a species known for their aggressive military traditions, stood to ask the question that had been troubling many professional soldiers throughout the galaxy. General Carter, this approach to warfare seems to eliminate the concepts of honor and fair combat that have guided military conduct for millennia. How do human forces maintain morale and unit cohesion when victory is achieved through deception rather than courage? The human general paused for a moment, considering how to explain a concept that was fundamental to human military thinking, but alien to most other species. Admiral, human military personnel understand that their primary responsibility is to protect the lives and interests of their people, not to provide entertainment for historians or satisfy abstract concepts of honor. We fight to win, and we use every available advantage to ensure that our enemies cannot harm those we are sworn to protect. The lecture continued for 2 hours, with General Carter explaining human tactical innovations that had revolutionized modern warfare. She described how human forces used psychological operations to demoralize enemy commanders, how they employed asymmetric tactics to neutralize superior firepower, and how they created battle conditions that made conventional military responses ineffective or counterproductive. The key difference between human military doctrine and traditional approaches is that we do not accept fair fights, the general said, summarizing the core principle that guided all human military operations. When human forces engage an enemy, we ensure that every possible advantage is on our side before the first shot is fired. This means superior intelligence, better positioning, more effective weapons deployment, and complete control over the tactical situation. The implications of what the audience was hearing began to sink in, as General Carter provided specific examples of how human forces had defeated supposedly superior enemies. The destruction of the Vorgak raiding fleet had been achieved through precise long-range fire from positions the enemy could not detect. The retreat of the Krillian attack force had resulted from psychological pressure and the demonstration of intelligence capabilities that made resistance seem futile. Ambassador Tony Martinez entered the lecture hall during the final portion of General Carter's presentation. The human diplomatic representative had spent the past 6 months traveling throughout Federation space, meeting with political leaders and military commanders who were still struggling to understand how the galactic balance of power had shifted so dramatically in such a short time. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to conclude today's presentation with some observations about the future of galactic military affairs, General Carter said, acknowledging Ambassador Martinez with a nod as he took a seat near the back of the amphitheater. Human military doctrine represents a fundamental evolution in how civilized species approach the problem of armed conflict. We do not fight battles to prove our courage or demonstrate our military prowess. We fight to solve problems, and we use whatever methods are most effective for achieving our objectives. The holographic display showed a timeline of military engagements throughout galactic history, with markers indicating the average duration and casualty rates for conflicts involving different species. The data revealed a disturbing pattern. As military technology had advanced over the centuries, wars had become longer and more destructive, with entire star systems being devastated by conflicts that could last for decades. Human military engagements average less than 1 hour in duration and result in minimal casualties on both sides, General Carter observed, highlighting the recent data points that represented human military operations. This is not because we are more merciful than other species, but because we create conditions where extended combat becomes impossible for our enemies. When human forces reveal themselves on a battlefield, the tactical situation has already been decided. Admiral Kethvar stood to ask the final question of the session, one that had been troubling him since his first encounter with human military capabilities. General Carter, if human forces are as capable as these examples suggest, why has your species chosen to join the Federation rather than establishing your own galactic empire? You clearly possess the military power to dominate any opposition. Helen Carter's expression became serious as she considered how to answer a question that touched on the fundamental principles that guided human civilization. Admiral, humans learned long ago that ruling through fear and military domination creates more problems than it solves. We prefer to work with other species as partners and allies, sharing our knowledge and capabilities for the benefit of everyone. However, we want all potential adversaries to understand that attacking human interests or threatening our people will result in consequences that they are not prepared to face. The symposium ended with a reception where Federation officers could continue their discussions with General Carter and other human military representatives. The conversations that took place during those informal meetings would influence military planning throughout the galaxy for years to come. As professional, soldiers began to understand that the rules of warfare had changed forever.